Welcome to our channel. Today, we're sharing another gripping and chilling story that's guaranteed to give you goosebumps. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're from and what time of day you're listening to this story. We're always curious to see where and when our stories reach you. Now sit back, turn off the lights, and get ready for a tale of mystery that will make you think twice. Rambo, my massive black and white dog, lay sprawled on the floor, panting heavily after another walk. His large paws instinctively reached out toward me, a subtle reminder that he was always by my side. This dog had been my constant companion, though admittedly, he wasn't the brightest creature around. But his loyalty and good-natured demeanor more than made up for any lack of intelligence. This is where it all began. Josh, my best friend, once came up with an idea that sounded irresistible: a weekend getaway far from the city, renting a cabin by Silverwood Lake. Joining us were Sarah and Emily, our friends and fellow board game enthusiasts. The three of them were borderline obsessed with tabletop games, and we often gathered for long gaming nights. But the idea of a weekend in nature with games, that was a whole new level. Well, I'm in only if I can bring Rambo, I said, already picturing him tearing through the forest in excitement. Josh rolled his eyes but agreed. When we arrived at the cabin, it was even better than the photos had suggested. The serene lake stretched out before us, like a mirror reflecting the dense trees along the shoreline. The cabin itself was spacious, complete with a balcony, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a small dock where a couple of old canoes awaited. Everything seemed perfect, but something already felt off. Down by the water, I noticed two boys. One was tossing pieces of torn-up styrofoam into the lake, laughing as a duck tried to peck at them. The other stood nearby, gripping a stick with a scowl, as if waiting for the right moment to hit something. Their behavior unsettled me. Who lets their kids act like that? I thought, brushing it off as none of my business. Rambo was immediately wary of them, his ears perking up and his eyes locked on their every movement. Better keep you on a leash, I decided, though I wasn't overly worried about how he might react. Still, the evening felt magical. We built a fire, roasted sausages, and played Carcassonne under the stars. Rambo, despite his usual rambunctious nature, lay quietly by the fire, pressed up against me as if he knew that his place was right there beside me. But even then, I started noticing little things. Every so often, Rambo would lift his head and look toward the woods. His ears twitched, and a low growl escaped his throat. It was enough to leave me with a vague sense of unease. I chalked it up to the presence of wild animals likely wandering nearby. That night, I fell asleep thinking we'd found the perfect spot. Quiet, secluded. But that quietness was deceptive. I woke at dawn to the sound of soft but persistent whining. Rambo was sitting by the door, looking at me with that familiar expression that meant only one thing: get up, I need to go out. Reluctantly, I pulled on my robe, slipped into my boots and opened the door. The morning air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Rambo immediately trotted toward the water, his black and white fur glistening in the first rays of sunlight. I yawned, watching him, and then noticed something strange. The canoes, which had been securely tied to the dock the previous evening, were now drifting in the middle of the lake, empty, like abandoned toys. What the hell? I muttered, squinting at the odd sight. Most likely, it was the work of those two boys I'd seen by the water the day before. For a moment, I thought I heard faint laughter echoing in the distance. Rambo finished with his business, bounded back toward me, covered in wet leaves. I brought him inside, already starting to forget the morning's peculiarities, when I decided to take him for a walk along the forest edge. That's when I saw those boys again. This time, they were fully outfitted, camo pants, large backpacks, and weapons. Slung over their shoulders were rifles, old models, more suited for hunting than anything you'd see at a shooting range. Rambo froze as we approached. He assumed his typical alert stance, head low, eyes fixed, tail raised. The boys noticed us. One of them, shorter and clearly younger, tilted his head and seemed to smile. But there was something unnerving about that smile. The other boy, older and taller, raised his hand, and it took me a moment to realize he was aiming at us. I tightened Rambo's leash, keeping him from lunging. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't answer. The younger boy whispered something to the older one, and without a word, they turned and disappeared into the forest. An uneasy feeling settled in my chest. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the sensation that invisible eyes were watching us. By evening, we gathered around the campfire again. Sarah and Emily, holding hands, were roasting potatoes in the coals, while Josh told a story I barely listened to. My thoughts kept drifting back to those boys and to Rambo, who remained restless. At one point, Rambo stood up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The fur on his back bristled, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. "What's wrong with him?" Emily asked, tensing. "Probably just an animal in the woods," I muttered, though I didn't believe it myself. Josh stood up and grabbed a flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said. "You shouldn't," I began, but he had already stepped into the shadows beyond the firelight. I stood and followed, gripping Rambo's leash tightly. We walked a few steps into the dark forest, the flashlight beam cutting erratically through the trees, revealing nothing. And then we heard it. A crunching sound, wet, predatory, like the noise of something tearing into raw meat. Rambo froze. His gaze snapped toward a spot beneath the trees, where a glint of light reflected off something, eyes staring back at us. "Josh, let's go back," I said, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. But Josh didn't listen. He stepped forward, raising the flashlight higher. The beam finally landed on something in the shadows, a figure. It crouched on all fours, its body contorted at an unnatural angle. It looked human, but its limbs were too long, too thin, almost inhuman. Then it turned to face us. Its eyes, empty and pupilless, glimmered briefly before the figure bolted into the forest. We stood frozen, unable to move, until Rambo tugged at the leash, urging us to get away. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted back to the campfire, breathless. Sarah and Emily stared at us with concern. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "Nothing," Josh said quickly, his voice trembling. I didn't tell them. We just sat by the fire as if nothing had happened. But I knew. This place was far from the peaceful retreat it seemed to be. The night was restless. Rambo, usually calm and obedient at night, kept shifting on his spot by the bed. Every now and then, I heard his muffled growl, and each time it woke me up. I thought it was just lingering nerves from our encounter in the woods, but when I opened my eyes at dawn, I saw Rambo standing by the window. His strong body was tense, his gaze fixed on something outside. "What is it, boy?" I muttered, getting up and walking over to him. I looked out the window, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The morning forest stretched out before me, dew glistening on the leaves, a faint mist curling over the lake. Nothing threatening. Yet Rambo remained alert. His tension seeped into me. At breakfast, we all gathered, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over us since last night. Sarah and Emily laughed, chatting about their plans for the day, while Josh nervously spun his fork in his hand, clearly trying to forget the events of the previous evening. "So, are we heading out on the water today?" Sarah asked, her smile bright. "The canoes are still floating in the middle of the lake," I replied. "If you want them, you'll have to swim a bit." "Perfect," she giggled. "A little exercise won't hurt." We headed down to the dock. It was quiet by the water, too quiet. Usually, mornings on the lake were filled with birdsong and the gentle lapping of waves, but now it seemed like all the life around us had gone still. Josh and Sarah took the canoe, leaving Emily and me on the shore with Rambo. I sat on the grass, enjoying the rare moment of calm. "It's such a beautiful day, isn't it?" Emily said, settling down beside me. "Yeah, but something feels off," I admitted, my eyes fixed on the lake. Emily frowned. "You're still thinking about yesterday?" I nodded. "Rambo feels it too. He's been on edge this whole time, and he's usually the one who keeps me calm." We fell silent, watching Josh and Sarah paddle toward the middle of the lake. Rambo suddenly stood up, his body taut, and let out a low growl. "What now?" I whispered, following his gaze. On the far side of the lake, something was moving. I spotted a dark figure in the tall grass. It was large, but it moved stealthily, as if stalking. "Maybe it's a deer?" Emily suggested. But I knew it wasn't a deer. It moved too slowly, like a predator. "Josh, Sarah," I called out, waving my arm. "Come back." They paused and turned toward me, but judging by their expressions, they thought I was joking. "We're fine," Sarah shouted back, laughing. I looked again, but the figure had vanished. On the way back to the cabin, Rambo acted strangely. He kept stopping, sniffing the air as if catching a scent. His tail was raised, his gaze darting around. I held the leash tightly, afraid he might bolt. That evening, I told the others about what I'd seen, but they brushed it off. "It's just your imagination," Josh said. "You're overthinking it." But I couldn't shake the unease. Something deep inside me told me we were being watched. Later that night, I heard a sound, a faint creak, like someone walking across wooden planks on tiptoe. I froze, straining to listen. Rambo growled, his eyes locked on the door. "Quiet, boy," I whispered, hoping it was just the wind. But then I heard it, a soft knock. Someone was outside. A soft knock echoed again, once, twice, 3 times, evenly spaced, as if whoever was outside was testing my resolve to open the door. Rambo's growls grew louder, his body taut like a coiled spring. Slowly, I got out of bed and approached the door. Through the curtains of the window, I tried to see who or what might be out there. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness faintly illuminated by the moon. Then, right on the doorstep, I spotted a figure. It was a boy. He looked about 10 or 11 years old, standing there in nothing but a pair of swim trunks, drenched to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. His skin was pale, almost marble-like, and his lips were tinged blue from the cold. the hell is he doing here? I muttered under my breath. Rambo's growl deepened, his claws tapping against the wooden floor as if he was barely restraining himself. "Easy, boy," I whispered, cracking the door open slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked the boy. He didn't respond. His eyes, blank and lifeless, stared through me. His face was void of emotion, save for a thin line of drool trailing down from the corner of his mouth. "Where are your parents?" I tried again, but he didn't move a muscle. Behind me, I heard footsteps. It was Josh emerging groggily from his room, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked. "This kid was just standing here at the door," I said, gesturing toward the boy outside. Josh stepped closer and crouched in front of him. "Hey, can you hear us? Are you okay?" he asked, snapping his fingers in front of the boy's face. No reaction. "He seems to be in shock," Josh said, standing up. "We should take him to the neighbors. He's probably one of the kids you saw earlier." I nodded, but couldn't shake the unease that gripped me. The boy looked wrong. His stillness, his vacant stare, his silent presence, it all felt off. Josh placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, gently guiding him toward the path leading to the neighboring cabin. "I'll take him over there, don't worry," Josh said, glancing back at me. "Stay here with Sarah and Emily." Rambo growled at the retreating boy, his eyes fixed on him until they disappeared into the trees. "Something's not right," I murmured under my breath as I shut the door. When I returned to the living room, Sarah and Emily were already waiting. "Who was that?" Emily asked, clutching a blanket to her chest. "Just some kid. Josh is taking him to the neighbors," I replied, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. We settled near the fireplace, trying to distract ourselves. Sarah suggested setting up a board game, but no one could concentrate. An hour passed. Josh still hadn't come back. "I think we should check on him," I said, standing up. Emily and Sarah nodded in agreement. We grabbed flashlights and stepped into the night. I left Rambo in the house, not wanting to risk him getting agitated again. The gravel path to the neighboring cabin crunched under our feet, the sound eerily loud in the unnerving stillness. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, as if even the wind was holding its breath. When we reached the cabin, the door was ajar. "Josh?" Sarah called out, peeking inside. No response. We stepped in, sweeping the room with our flashlight beams. The cabin's layout was nearly identical to ours: simple furniture, a fireplace, a few photos on the walls. But there was something subtly, unsettlingly different. Clothes lay scattered on the floor. A pair of swim trunks, a damp towel, a shirt, all tossed carelessly, as if removed in a hurry. "Are those the boys' clothes?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly the lights flickered on. Sarah let out a sharp scream, and we all spun around. Josh was standing in the center of the room. His face was unnaturally pale, his lips slightly parted, and his eyes, they were just as empty and lifeless as the boys'. He swayed, his body jerking unnaturally, as if he were a puppet with tangled strings. "Josh?" I called out. He looked at me but said nothing. His head twitched slightly to the side, and then he collapsed to the floor. In the tense silence, we heard it. Footsteps. They were coming from upstairs. Josh lay on the floor, his chest heaving unevenly, as if every breath was a battle. I rushed to his side, shaking him by the shoulders. "Josh, hey, wake up." His eyes were open but unfocused, staring into the void. Sarah and Emily stood frozen, their fear palpable. Is he breathing? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Yeah, but something's wrong, I replied, listening to his ragged breathing. Suddenly, Emily let out a sharp gasp, pointing upward. There's someone up there. From above, dull thuds echoed through the ceiling, like slow, dragging footsteps. Each step was uneven, as if whoever or whatever was moving had trouble walking. I'm calling 911, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. At the same time, Sarah aimed her flashlight toward the staircase, her hands shaking uncontrollably. We need to get out of here, she whispered, though her eyes remained fixed on the dark landing at the top of the stairs. The footsteps drew closer to the staircase. I heard the dispatcher's voice faintly through the phone, but couldn't focus on the words. We're at a cabin near Silverwood Lake. My friend, I began, but the words caught in my throat as I saw who was coming down. It was the boy, the same boy. His wet swim trunks left a trail of water on the steps, and his face was smeared with something dark, blood. Run, I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. But Emily was rooted to the spot, her eyes wide with terror. The boy took a step toward her, and that's when Rambo burst through the door. My dog was a blur of motion, a storm of fury. He lunged at the boy, knocking him to the ground. The boy let out a screech, a sound so unnatural it was more like the howl of a wounded animal than a human cry. Go, now, I yelled again. Sarah and Emily bolted first, and I glanced back. Rambo was still snarling, his jaws locked onto the boy's arm as the figure writhed beneath him. But it wasn't a boy anymore. His body contorted, his skin stretched, and what I saw made no sense. I turned and ran after the girls, leaving Rambo behind. We scrambled into our cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. What was that? Who was that boy? Emily's voice cracked as she shouted, her body trembling. That wasn't a boy, I muttered, realizing how insane it sounded. Rambo didn't come back. The rest of the night was a tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the faint rustle of leaves outside. Every sound made us jump. At one point, I heard heavy footsteps on the porch. Cautiously, I moved to the window and peered out. Josh was there. He stood motionless, staring blankly at the cabin. It's him, Sarah whispered, creeping up beside me. No, it's not, I said, my stomach knotting as I watched his empty eyes dart aimlessly back and forth. I didn't know what to do. Josh was our friend, but something had changed him, something in the woods, or in that boy. At dawn, I made my decision. I'm going to find Rambo, I said, grabbing a flashlight and a knife. You're insane, Emily cried. That's suicide. He saved us. I can't just leave him out there. I opened the door and stepped into the foggy morning. The morning greeted me with a silence heavier than any sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching my every move. I gripped the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, my eyes darting through the trees, searching for any sign of Rambo. I couldn't forget how he'd thrown himself into protecting us. My dog had always been loyal, but that night he became my hero. I clung to the hopes that I'd find him alive. My footsteps on the damp ground echoed louder than I wanted. The forest, usually alive with rustling leaves and birdsong, was deathly still. No wind, no movement, just the damp smell of decaying leaves and the bitter taste of fear on my lips. I stopped by a small creek. In the muddy banks, I spotted paw prints, large and familiar. Rambo, I breathed, a flicker of hope lighting up inside me. The tracks led deeper into the woods. I followed them, trying not to think about where they might end. About half an hour later, I heard a sound, a low, quiet growl coming from somewhere in the dense undergrowth. I froze, gripping the knife tightly. Rambo? Is that you? A rustle, then slow, deliberate footsteps. From behind the bushes emerged a figure. At first, I thought it was the boy again, but as it got closer, I realized I was wrong. It was a man, tall and pale, his clothes torn, his hands and face smeared with blood. Are you okay? My voice shook, but I tried to sound firm. He didn't answer. His eyes were empty, like the boy's, and his movements were clumsy, almost mechanical. I stepped back, raising the knife defensively. Don't come any closer. The man stopped. His head jerked to the side, as if he heard something I couldn't. Then he let out a low, guttural growl and took a step forward. I braced myself, ready to defend myself, but then a familiar shape burst from the shadows. Rambo. My dog barreled into the man, knocking him to the ground. Their bodies rolled across the earth and vanished into the bushes. I heard snarling, grunts, and the sounds of a violent struggle. Rambo, I shouted, running after them. When I reached the bushes, the man was gone. Only Rambo stood there, panting heavily. His muzzle was stained with blood, and his eyes seemed strangely hollow. Rambo, are you okay? I dropped to my knees, slowly reaching out to him. He didn't move. His gaze locked onto me as if he was trying to remember who I was. It's me, buddy. It's okay. We're going home. His tail wagged slowly and uncertainly, and I felt a wave of relief. Let's go, I said, standing up. We started back toward the cabin. Rambo trailed behind me, his steps heavy and deliberate. I could hear his breathing, but I didn't dare turn around. Something wasn't right. When we reached the cabin, I noticed the door was open. Sarah and Emily stood on the porch, their faces tight with worry. You found him, Sarah exclaimed, but her joy quickly turned to concern as she took in Rambo's state. What's wrong with him? Emily asked, her voice trembling. He's just tired, I lied, running a hand over his head. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were inside the house. I woke to a sound. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the house. At first, I thought it was Rambo, but then I saw him standing at the doorway to the hall. His body was tense, the fur on his back bristling. What is it, buddy? I whispered, though deep down I already knew. The footsteps didn't belong to a person or an animal. They sounded wrong, each step too slow, with long pauses between the heavy thuds against the floor. I got out of bed, gripping my flashlight and knife. Rambo moved with me, growling low in his throat. We stepped into the hallway. The house, so cozy during the day, now felt stretched and distorted, filled with shadows. The footsteps continued, and I aimed the flashlight toward the sound. In the beam of light, I saw a figure. It was Josh. He stood by the window, his arms limp at his sides, his head tilted at an unnatural angle so I couldn't see his face. His posture was strange, unnatural, like a puppet abandoned mid-performance. Josh, I called out, but he didn't respond. Slowly, his head turned toward me. His face was deathly pale, and his eyes empty, devoid of recognition. Rambo's growl grew louder. Are you okay? I tried again, stepping closer. Suddenly, Josh's body jerked. His frame twisted, his limbs contorting, as if his bones had snapped. He let out a low, guttural sound and lunged at me. I barely had time to raise the knife before Rambo lunged, colliding with him and knocking him to the floor. Their bodies tumbled toward the staircase, and a moment later, I heard a heavy thud at the bottom. Damn it, I breathed, racing downstairs. In the living room, I saw a scene I would never forget. Josh lay on the floor, but he wasn't Josh anymore. His body writhed, his skin cracking like dried earth. Rambo stood beside him, his jaws open but hesitating to strike. "Run!" Sarah screamed, bolting from the room with Emily close behind. I wanted to follow them, but Josh's gaze locked with mine. It wasn't just a look, it was a living, seething darkness. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements jerky and mechanical. "Go," I said, glancing back at the girls. Rambo growled again, preparing to attack, but I grabbed his collar. "No, buddy, we're leaving." I turned and sprinted for the door, pulling Rambo along with me. Outside, the night was pitch black, moonless. Sarah and Emily stood by the car, their faces stricken with terror. "Start it," I yelled, dragging Rambo to the back door. Emily's shaking hands unlocked the car, and we scrambled inside. Sarah floored the gas pedal, gravel spraying as the car surged forward. From the rear window, I saw Josh's figure emerge from the house. He stood on the porch, his hollow eyes following us. "What happened to him?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she gripped the wheel. That's not Josh," I whispered, clutching Rambo tightly. The car sped into the night, leaving the house far behind. But the fear stayed with me. Something had come for us, and I knew this wasn't over. We drove several miles before Sarah dared to slow down. Emily sat in the front seat, quietly sobbing into her hands. I was in the back, clutching Rambo tightly, feeling his tense body start to relax slightly. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "What's happening?" "I don't know," I replied, the words sounding hollow even to myself. We were surrounded by the dark night. For a moment, it seemed like we were safe, but the peace was deceptive. The forest remained eerily quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath, watching us. "We can't just drive aimlessly," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need help." "There's a police station in Ashland," I said, recalling the nearest town. Sarah nodded, turning onto a gravel road leading toward the city. But the farther we drove, the stronger the feeling that something was following us. Rambo suddenly lifted his head and let out a low growl. "What is it?" Sarah asked, not taking her eyes off the road. I glanced out the window. Something large moved at the edge of the headlight's beam, too large to be human. "Speed up," I said, gripping the back of the seat. Sarah pressed the gas pedal, and the car surged forward. Tree branches flashed by like fleeting shadows, but then I saw it again. Something stood in the road ahead. It looked human, but its body was distorted. It was taller than any person, and its limbs were unnaturally long. Its head was tilted, as if listening to the sound of our car. Sarah screamed and jerked the wheel to avoid hitting it. The car skidded, the wheels slid off the road, and we came to a jarring halt with a dull thud. "Is everyone okay?" I croaked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I think so," Emily replied, her voice laced with panic. Rambo barked, his deep voice echoing in the silence. I peered out the window. Whatever we had seen was gone, but the forest around us no longer felt empty. Rustling sounds and faint movements surrounded the car. "We need to get out of here," I said, opening the door. "Are you insane?" Emily cried. "The car won't start," I said, checking under the hood. "If we stay here, it'll find us." I grabbed the flashlight and the knife I still had and let Rambo out of the car. "We can't leave the car," Sarah protested, but I had already started walking along the road. "Then stay here. I'll go for help," I shot back, glancing over my shoulder. Sarah sighed and, after exchanging a nervous glance with Emily, hurried to catch up with me. We walked in complete darkness, our flashlights barely illuminating the path. The forest seemed alive, breathing around us. I heard rustling to the right, then to the left. The feeling that something unseen was stalking us grew stronger with every step. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing ahead. Through the fog, a figure appeared on the edge of the road. It stood motionless, as if waiting for us. I raised the flashlight, aiming the beam at it. It was Josh. His face was blank, his body swayed slightly, as if pulled in different directions. But the most horrifying part was that he was speaking. His voice was low, repeating the same words over and over. "Go, back, go, back." "That's not Josh," Emily whispered, gripping my arm tightly. Rambo leapt forward, barking furiously, his voice slicing through the night. The figure suddenly let out a deep, inhuman roar and charged at us. I tightened my grip on the knife and stepped forward. Josh's figure hurtled toward us like a living whirlwind, his body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet on frayed strings. I stepped forward, gripping the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Rambo lunged, his bark transforming into a guttural growl. He slammed into Josh with such force that Josh toppled to the ground, but it didn't stop him. Josh sprang back up instantly, grabbing Rambo by the scruff and hurling him aside with terrifying strength. "No," I shouted, rushing toward my dog. Rambo seemed unharmed. He rolled over, rose to his feet, and readied himself for another attack. But now I could see that Josh wasn't just human anymore. His arms seemed unnaturally long, his skin shimmered as though stretched too tightly, and his eyes, they no longer belonged to my friend. "That's not him anymore," Sarah whispered, stepping back in horror. I turned to the girls. "Run to the city. Get help." "We can't leave you," Emily cried, but Sarah grabbed her hand and began pulling her away. "Go," I barked, and finally they started running toward Ashland. Left alone, I stepped forward again. Josh stood across from me, emitting a low, guttural growl, his mouth slightly open to reveal teeth that now appeared unnaturally sharp. "Josh, if you're still in there, fight it," I said, but my words vanished into the oppressive silence. He lunged. I barely managed to dodge. The flashlight flew out of my hand and extinguished, leaving us in near darkness. Only faint moonlight filtered through the branches, casting distorted shadows. Rambo charged again, his powerful body colliding with Josh. They tumbled to the ground, growling and snarling. Their fight became a horrifying blur of movement and sound. Frantically, I scrambled to retrieve the knife that had slipped from my grip. By the time I picked it up, Josh was already standing, his chest heaving as his body convulsed violently. "I'm sorry, buddy," I whispered, and I did what had to be done. The knife plunged straight into his chest. Josh let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. His body trembled, shuddering violently, before collapsing onto the ground. For a moment, everything was still. I dropped to my knees beside Rambo, pulling him close. His fur was damp with blood, but he was alive. "Good boy," I murmured, struggling to hold back tears. The silence around us was absolute, but I knew this wasn't over. The forest was still alive, still watching. I stood, retrieving my flashlight, and turned it toward Josh's body. His face had softened or returned to its human form. His eyes were lifeless, his features peaceful. It was him again, my friend. "I'm sorry," I whispered, knowing he would never hear me. Struggling to lift Rambo, I started moving. We had to catch up with Sarah and Emily, find our way to the city, and warn everyone about the horror lurking in these woods. Behind me, I heard a crack. I froze. No, I exhaled, turning slowly. Josh's body twitched. His eyes snapped open again, and this time, there was nothing human left in them. Josh's body twitched again, rising from the ground like a marionette suspended by invisible strings. His eyes, now fully black, locked onto me. "Damn it," I muttered, helping Rambo to his feet. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, my dog growled fiercely, positioning himself between me and the creature. I took a step back, keeping my eyes on Josh, or what was left of him, but I knew we couldn't hold out much longer. "You want this?" I shouted, gripping the knife tightly. "Then come and get me." I turned and bolted, desperate to draw the creature away from Rambo and anyone else who might still survive. Branches whipped against my face, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear the heavy thuds of Josh's footsteps and his ragged, inhuman breathing growing closer. "Keep going, buddy," I whispered to myself, trying to stay on course. Rambo ran alongside me, his movements steady, though I could see the toll the night had taken on him. The forest around us began to shift. The mist thickened, and the trees stretched unnaturally, their gnarled branches resembling claws. It felt as though the woods were alive, complicit in this nightmare. At last, I reached an old stone ravine we'd seen when we first arrived. I knew this spot could serve as the stage for one final stand, my last chance to destroy whatever remained of Josh. The creature emerged from the fog. It no longer moved like a man. Its body was grotesquely bent, its arms elongated, and its skin stretched so taut it threatened to split. This wasn't Josh anymore. "All right, let's end this," I said, gripping the knife tightly. Rambo growled, but I held up a hand to stop him. "You've done enough, boy. This is my fight now." The creature lunged forward with inhuman speed. I managed to dodge, slashing my knife across its side, but it barely flinched. It struck me with such force that I flew backward, slamming into a rock. Pain shot through my body, but I couldn't let it stop me. "Come on, let's finish this," I yelled, brandishing the knife. The creature leapt again, but this time Rambo charged at it. He collided with the thing, sending them both tumbling into the ravine. "No!" I screamed, rushing to the edge. I watched as they rolled down the rocky slope. Rambo snarled and bit into the creature's neck, his jaws locked tightly, but the thing was stronger. It lifted him effortlessly and threw him against a boulder. Rambo hit the ground with a sickening thud and didn't move again. I slid down the ravine, abandoning all caution. Rambo lay near the stone, his eyes open, but his breathing faint. "I'm so sorry, boy," I whispered, stroking his head gently. The creature advanced slowly, savoring its approach. I grabbed the heaviest rock I could find, and when it was close enough, I swung with all my strength. The rock connected with a sickening crunch, followed by a deafening screech. The creature collapsed, its body convulsing violently before dissolving into black dust, scattering in the faint morning light. I turned back to Rambo. "You did it, buddy." I said, tears streaming down my face, but he was already gone. I emerged from the forest at dawn. Sarah and Emily had found help, but no one believed what I told them. Josh's body was never recovered. Later, I learned that the forest where it all happened was infamous for its legends, stories of strange entities that could warp and twist people into something monstrous. Whoever or whatever caused this horror, I knew one thing. Rambo had given his life to save mine. Every night I think about what I could have done differently, and every time the wind carries the scent of damp earth, I swear I can hear a bark. Rambo.